People in, but we'll get started in just a minute. Welcome. Thank you for sharing your Sunday with us. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, and then we'll let everyone else kind of come in as they do. Hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Kerfoot, the Deputy Director of Events at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's PNP Live. A couple of housekeeping items to go over before we start the program. First, I'm going to be dropping a link in the chat in just a minute where you can purchase a copy of A Door Between Us straight from PNP's website. And if you live in the DC area and you don't feel like waiting for shipping, you can actually select in-store pickup at checkout, and you can get your book at any of our 3 store locations around the area. You can also ask our author a question tonight by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can submit a question at any time during the talk tonight. So anything that pops in your mind, just go ahead and submit that there. All right, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Ehsaneh Sadr is an Iranian-American novelist and activist with a PhD in international relations. She has worked in various capacities on campaigns related to biking advocacy, Palestinian human rights, Iranian sanctions, access to credit for rural villagers, and safe spaces for children in crisis. Her new book, A Door Between Us, weaves together the lives of 3 characters to form a story that demonstrates that even as the world is falling apart around us, choices matter. Moderating this conversation is Ausma Zehanat, author of The Unquiet Dead, The Bloodprint, and many more. She has been featured in Shondaland's profile of Muslim women authors everyone should know, and she holds a PhD in international human rights law with a research specialization in military intervention and war crimes. So this talk is going to be so informative and interesting. I can't wait to get started. So everyone, please help me welcome these amazing women to PNP Live. Hi, guys.
Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for having us, Brittany. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a huge honor for me to be involved with this and to moderate this conversation with Ehsaneh. I first read Ehsaneh's book, A Door Between Us, several months ago. And it's just this gorgeous, intimate study. And it's a very difficult thing for an author to do, to write a book that's about internal, personal, family dynamics, and then to give us a sense of the history and culture that they're based in, but also to be providing us with this very sensitive, nuanced, complex perspective at a critical moment in history, recent history, the Iranian elections in 2009, commonly known as the stolen elections, where the Iranian people rose up en masse and asked the question, where is my vote? When the election didn't turn out to reflect the fact that how they had voted and that they had voted. So it's a great pleasure to be here to speak with Ehsaneh and to ask her to tell us a little bit more about the whole process. So I have a whole slew of questions to get through. But first I want to just say, Ehsaneh, welcome. And could you set the stage for us a little? I understand that you have a presentation that you're going to show us, and we'd love to see that. And then I'm going to take you through your book question by question.
Well, first, I just want to say I'm so excited to be here. Politics and Prose is a bookstore that I grew up going to as a teenager and as a young adult. So it just feels incredible to get to be here as an author. So I'm really excited, and I couldn't ask for someone better to be doing this conversation with. Ausma, I don't know if you even know, but when I was initially pitching my book, part of the reason, so for people who are watching, Ausma and I share an agent. Part of the reason, and the process of trying to find an agent is not easy. So you're querying and querying. And I had written this book that was about this strange event that had happened far away that not a lot of people knew about. People couldn't maybe get their heads around. And one of the reasons that our agent was, I think, interested in my work is she had just read a draft of your book that was one of the few treatments in fiction of the green wave. And so that really put her in the mindset of being able to kind of understand what the book was about. And I had already read, The Unquiet Dead and other books by you, and this book hadn't come out yet. And so it was really exciting to hear. And that really kind of paved the way and opened the way. And I would just say, I mean, the other thing, your entire Blood Print series, which is just this incredible treatment of this new fantasy world that draws on all of these Muslim themes and has made me think about different events in a completely different way. And I'm actually gonna do a little shout out for the Blade Bone that just came out.
Thank you very much.
Because it is beautiful and amazing, and just look at the cover. And so, you know, if people are thinking about, as the holiday season is coming up and looking for a way to support politics and prose, these are some other books that they can be looking at. So yes, I do have a presentation, so I'm going to hop into that. Let me see if I can share my screen correctly. All right. So basically, there are two things that I'm going to be covering here. And the first is a little bit about my background and connection to Iran. And then the second is a little bit of the historical context of what was going on in Iran in 2009, which is when the book takes place. So I kind of titled this Iran in 1979, 1999, and 2009. Nope. Let's see. Okay, there we go. My beautiful mom and dad. These are my parents. They met when they were students in LA in the 70s, and politics was really a part of their relationship and lives from the very beginning. They were very involved in organizing and supporting the student movement in the United States against the Iranian king, or the Shah. And then as they got married, and then I appeared, and then my little brother appeared, and then another little brother appeared. So the family's growing, but all along, they're still following very closely everything that's going on in Iran, particularly as the protests were heating up in 1978. And it was really just shortly after this last picture was taken, my dad, he just kind of couldn't stand it any longer, being so far away from his brothers, from his friends, from other people that were risking so much in the streets. And so my parents decided, you know, and for me now I think about, wow, what a big decision. But they decided my mom and the three kids were going to stay here while my dad went to Iran. And the idea was that hopefully, you know, the revolution would be successful. And then once things settled down, she and us kids would join. And that's pretty much what happened. So my dad was there. He got there in late 1978. And so, you know, he was there for a lot of the really seminal moments in Iran. This is when the king was finally kicked out, the Shah and his wife. And then this is when Khomeini came back, and the hope that this was going to be this new and democratic regime in Tehran. And then we joined shortly after that. There's this quote that, you know, recently I was talking to my mom and dad about, you know, what was that like? You know, this big decision, you've got this young family, these kids, and you know, I think my dad kind of felt, you know, it was a tough decision. Maybe it wasn't the right decision, but I don't regret it. You know, I was there for a lot of these moments and really felt like I needed to be involved. And my mom said something that I thought was really interesting. She said, I was excited to be in Iran. I felt I was having an experience similar to our founding fathers as they broke away from Britain to establish their own democratic experience. So for her, it was also very exciting to be there. Sadly, as we know, the democratic experience and experiment in Iran went awry pretty quickly. And by the time I was going into third grade or so, my parents felt that it just was no longer safe. Too many of their friends and family had been persecuted by the regime. People had had to leave. People had been jailed. We were lucky enough to be able to get out and then moved to be with my grandparents in Salt Lake. Let's see. So this is another brother that then arrived, brother number 3. This is in Salt Lake. And then we moved to DC, there's brother number 4. This is still in DC, brother number 5. This is a picture with my grandmother shortly after. It was hard to find a picture of like all 6 of us and my parents at that time. So this is with my grandma when she was coming to help out. Unfortunately, during those years, it didn't feel safe to visit Iran, but not too long after I finished my undergraduate degree, and I was sort of looking for some adventure and a way to connect, and, you know, had romantic ideas of someplace to go and serve. I'd also thought about joining the Peace Corps. it seemed like by then things had settled down a bit, and I decided that I was going to move to Iran. So this is a picture of me with my beautiful cousin Nilüfer there in the middle in the white, and her husband and twin girls. Sadly, tragically, my cousin was on the flight 752 that was recently shot down by an Iranian missile. I lived with them when I was in Tehran, and it was just a really wonderful opportunity to reconnect with the family. Among other things, while I was in Iran, I worked with the Ministry of Jihad Against Poverty, with a number of colleagues who were devoted to trying to expand economic access and opportunity for Iranian villages. On the left there is a picture of the ministry in Tehran where we would meet for most of our work. And then there are some pictures of the villages that we were working in. So my family in Iran was, for the most part, not super religious, and they definitely were not regime supporters, but many of my work colleagues were. And so it was a really fascinating experience getting to talk to folks about what does it mean to support the regime, and how does one sort of justify some of the darker aspects of the regime, and how were folks thinking, kind of evolving over time as they were seeing different things that were happening, and it was turning out to be very different than maybe they'd originally hoped. And then as it turned out, I ended up meeting and falling in love with and marrying someone whose family weren't just regime supporters, but were really had people that were actually part of the regime, in that they'd held numerous senior positions in the government. So that was kind of a whole new level of conversation and thinking, and about people, where people stand on different issues, and how does it feel for me? How did it feel for Hamid? How does it feel for the family? And there was also, I got to be part of this family life. This was something that was new for me as well. And in some ways maybe felt very different, but then in other ways, there were all these things that were so familiar and similar to maybe, say family life in Salt Lake City or even Washington, D.C. So these were some of the experiences and opportunities to get to be a part of a new family, to get to reconnect with Iran, to the point where I had those deeper conversations and met folks and thought about things in different ways, and wanted to draw on that and share those views and perspectives in writing. So now I'm going to switch to the 2009 election. So what's really interesting, and I had no way of knowing this when I started writing, is to note now some of the parallels between the 2009 election in Iran and the current election in the US. So in 2009, you had an incumbent, Ahmadinejad, on the right, who was running against the challenger, Mousavi, on the left. And Ahmadinejad, he was definitely the regime-favored candidate. He was one of those talk-off-the-cuff kind of people who would say these really outrageous types of things, who didn't really care who he offended. His challenger, Mousavi, was seen as this older statesman and really seen as someone who perhaps favored more liberal and democratic principles. One of the things that was unusual and refreshing about Mousavi was the extent to which his wife, Zahra Rahnafard, who is pictured there as well, also had a public persona and was involved with the campaign. So we were no longer living in Iran in 2009, but we visited quite often, and we happened to be there just a couple months before the election. This is me and my kids with my in-laws. And Mousavi's candidacy had generated a lot of enthusiasm. You would see folks really sometimes just gathering spontaneously in the streets. The campaign had adopted the color green, so you'd see folks with these green banners and green balloons all over the place. Now, by election day, we were back in the States, and we were really excited to see this huge election day turnout that seemed to bode really well for Mousavi. These are some of the long lines people were standing in to vote. We're starting to see some similar pictures of people standing in long lines to vote in the US as well. But it was a big shock that night when state television reported almost immediately after the polls closed that Ahmadinejad was the winner. Mousavi himself did not accept the results, and he called for the people's vote to be defended. So over the next few days, Ausma, you had said that people were asking, where's my vote? There is a picture of people, millions of Iranians with that banner, where is my vote? And you can see the green color of Mousavi's election had turned into the color of protest, and the green movement was born. The cover of my book that has the green fabric, that was inspired by the green banners and scarves and other things that brave protesters were using at the time. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before the government cracked down on the protesters in a very scary way, and Tehran really turned into a battlefield. One of the things that was interesting as going through this time period was hearing how friends and family in Iran were talking about it and processing it. And one thing that was really interesting for me was I couldn't always predict who was going to say something like, you know, something very much in favor of the protests, and who was actually going to take the position that this was a plot by Western powers to overthrow the government. So it was interesting to see families and friends split in some different ways. And so for the book, I was really interested in capturing that moment in time and exploring that experience of the 2009 election through the eyes of families that we in the West often don't get to hear from. So this is the context of the book of what's going on when it then opens on the scene of a wedding between Sarah and Ali. And the wedding was arranged between families that felt like they were very, you know, had a lot in common. And then all of a sudden, this election happens. There are these protests, the government crackdown, and the families see this in very different ways and suddenly realize, wow, we have a lot of differences and we're not sure that we want this wedding to take place anymore. So we've got this family tension going on. And then in addition to that, Sarah and Ali get dragged into what's going on in the streets when on their wedding night, they impulsively decide to let a protester into their car so she can hide from the paramilitary Basijis that are chasing her down. So that is where I'm going to stop. All right.
Oh, that was wonderful. And so many, I have 1,000 new questions that are not on my list of prepared questions. But I found it so interesting what you said about your family's journey to Iran, because as you know, I'm married to an Iranian, and his family had a similar journey where after they were supporters of Khomeini, and after they were in Canada, and then they moved back to Iran because they wanted to be there to be part of the revolution and to rebuild this new country. And then within 4 years, they could see where it was going, and they moved back to Canada again. So that was really fascinating to see that there was this moment of hope, just like there was in 2009, of people thinking that they're going to transform their country. So let me take you from the overarching political back to the personal in your story. And the first question I wanted to ask you is, as you open with this young couple, you see this young husband, Ali, and he seems apolitical, and he wants to stay out of politics altogether. And he encourages his wife-to-be, soon wife-to-be, to do the same thing. So I had two questions about that. And one is about the book. Did Ali feel that way because he was tired of politics and it didn't touch his life, or did he have more personal reasons? And then the second part of my question is, do you think young people in Iran today have been disappointed so many times that they've become simply apolitical?
Such good questions. First, I just want to say, I mean, it's so interesting to hear Nader's backstory too, because I think we're a small, you know, there are a lot of stories of Iranians kind of migrating different directions, and it's a smaller subset of folks who were here and were supporters and excited to go back and then came back, unfortunately. So yeah, I love the question about Ali. And, you know, I think, first of all, in thinking about this, there's the question of what and when are people most likely to be political anyway? And I think often, as long as the political situation is sort of stable, it's sort of good enough, there's going to be a good percentage of folks who are not going to be inclined. They're busy with their lives. They're not going to be super involved. But then when things are not going well, so then you want change. But the question is, do you feel like you can make a difference? And what are the dangers that are associated with getting involved? What do you have to lose? And how bad is the situation? Like, is it so bad that what you had to lose seems small or very big by comparison? And I think these questions are very different for each individual, but I think it also comes back to where you are in whatever society you're in. And for Ali in particular, he's actually fairly privileged in that society. He's Iranian, he's not Kurdish, he's not Baha'i, he's not one of the other groups of folks that are particularly oppressed in Iran. He's from a religious family, so there's to some extent, he feels like his family's values are reflected in the Islamic government or regime. He's making money, he's doing well. So you can assume perhaps that this is a character who voted for Mousavi. Maybe he would have liked to have his preferred candidate in power, but does he care enough that he's actually going to endanger what he has to go out in the streets and fight for it? I mean, I think folks like, so in going to the book again, Azar and Ibrahim, who were people who are also from the same class as Ali, could also perhaps just stay in academia or stay in their jobs and not get too involved. But there are people like that who just cannot stand, they just can't bear the injustice. And even if it's not impacting their lives, they're going to go out in the streets and they're going to fight for it. So I think, so that's kind of, Ali, and compared with some of the other characters in the book. But back to the question of Iranians in general, what's tough right now is the price of protest is very high. And I think the sense of, can we actually make things better is really low. So it's the only thing that will overcome the kind of natural inclination to stay safe is when things get so bad that you feel that you have nothing to lose. And right now, for the most part, I think Iranians are pushed to that when the economy is doing so badly that they literally aren't able to pay for food or fuel. And so you've seen over the past few years, most people are not out in the street protesting because of politics directly. It's because of economic issues that they're facing, where they're literally just hoping that they can get enough to get by. So that's kind of a long answer, but those are some of the things that I'm thinking about, as I'm thinking about whether people are going to go back in the streets or what kind of incentives they're facing as they're making those choices.
Yeah, and I think that's a really sharp analysis, this idea of what does the struggle for human rights cost? Because we sometimes see these huge sweeping movements, or we often see them, and then we don't understand truly what the individual cost is. So when I was writing Among the Ruins, for example, I interviewed a number of former political prisoners who had been so enthusiastic about the Green Wave and so eager to be on the streets. And everybody was wearing the magic green bracelet to emphasize their solidarity with Mousavi. But after they had come out from, say, Evin or Cadizak, and I spoke to them and I said, was it worth it? And would you do it again? Because you've lost everything you gained during the Green Movement. And every single one of them said they would never protest in that way again because of the price that they had paid in prison. Even if they were only detained for a few hours in a police station, they were so frightened by the experience, by the actual brutality, the psychological implication that violence was coming. And so they would repeat these it almost sounded like a mantra, that it's always better to work within the system. And so for those of us who've never paid that price personally, it's almost easy to war game it and say, oh, you should have done this or you should have done that. But when you live the experience and you still want all those things that you took those risks for, it's really, really disheartening to see the impact that power has on the average protester. Is that something that you found in your research process for writing the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for folks, again, facing that calculus, and I think it's in Iran, I think it's other places as well, when you're trying to decide, are you going to go out in the streets? Do you want to prevent your children from going out in the streets? That calculus of what is there to gain versus how much there is to lose. And sadly, I think that does end up being, and that's where it's so interesting when people still make that choice to go out and risk things. And I think often one of the perhaps disservices we do, often in history, we pay a lot of attention to those human rights struggles where we've been successful. And that gives this impression that most human rights struggles, you're going to get to a place where you win in the end. There's a celebration. If you're looking at South Africa or slavery or all these World War II, where these things, it seems like they always end in our favor. And human rights activism, as you well know, is you lose and you lose and you lose and you still go on. There's still worth in the struggle, in the necessity of that struggle, so that future generations can get to a better place. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that necessarily you are the one who's going to see the fruits of that struggle.
Absolutely. And then there's all these different ways of counting the cost. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, maybe like Nader, now that you've written this book, you possibly can't return to Iran. So Nader hasn't been able to return since 1999 because he's been an outspoken critic of the regime. How has your experience been in that regard?
Yeah, so that has been definitely a conversation within our family about what makes sense. And there are other things that are happening, that have been happening over the last 4 years between Iran and the United States, where it feels like people are just being taken as hostages, where it feels less safe to go to Iran anyway, at this point, with the book being out and the criticisms that are in the book toward the regime. The thing that's tough is there's no place I can submit my book and say, hey, tell me, does this cross the line?
Yeah, exactly.
Will I be okay?
The minute you submit it, you're basically flagging yourself to be detained.
Exactly. Like, I can't test this out before I go. It's just, you have to go and hope for the best, but the risk is really high, as we know, with people who are in prison right now. So that's something that we would think very, very carefully about before going back, which is a shame, because we do have close family, and we had been traveling to Iran about every other year for a long time.
Yeah, and it's the same for my husband too, where he has a huge family there that he hasn't seen now in 20 years and can't see. And that even when he's interacting with family members, he has to tell them, it always has to be encrypted. You always have to be told that, watch this, watch that, don't mention me in this context, and so on. And I've seen him now with a new generation of Iranian students who've come abroad to study, and they're also interested in going back and looking at what's been happening in Iranian politics and culture, and then also taking the same risks when they return. And he'll say, and then providing all their contact information in case of being detained or in prison, so someone can work on a campaign to get them out. And that is just ordinary life for so many people around the globe. And I remember when I was interviewing political prisoners, and I was asking them about the costs of protest in Iran, so many of them said, well, we don't want what happened in Syria to happen to us. And which again tells you about the nature of these regimes. So let me take you a little bit out of politics now and ask you about another aspect of the book that I thought was really gorgeous and intimate and infinitely touching, which is that motherhood seems to be a very important theme in the story. Mothers are separated from their children. They're being judged constantly by other members of the community about how they raise their children. And some of these mothers seem out of touch with what the next generation is feeling or what they're hoping for their future. So tell us a little bit about why that was such an important theme in the book for you.
Yeah, I think it's a very personal, I happen to have been raised and grew up in a family where motherhood was really something that was celebrated. It was something that was valued, and not just in a kind of be a mother and don't say anything or be in the home type of way. These were women who were really leaders in the community, running PTAs, running neighborhood associations, running political campaigns, other important efforts. So I really had this sense of mothers as leaders. And that was something that I think it was interesting. This question is interesting to me because it's not something that I necessarily set out consciously that I'm going to write about motherhood, but I can see that it was, it's just as authors, there are these things that are a part of you that are infused as a part of you, and it just comes out in your writing. And I think for sure, like many people, even mothers who are home, but then are also head of the neighborhood association, all these things, you're balancing these different roles, and you're trying to figure out for your family, when are you needed? What are the things that you need to do for the children to be there? And then what are the things that you do as a citizen and a human? And I think this trade-off is even more intense when it comes to someone like Azar, who's making a decision about social justice activism. And you feel, what do you do when you feel compelled to fight for what will hopefully be a better future for your children, but in the present moment, you're putting your children at risk? And it's so hard, because if you could say, we're going to put my family, we're going to go through hell for 6 months or a year, but then at the end of that 6 months or a year, then we know that there's going to be a better outcome. It's a lot easier to make that kind of a choice, but when you're risking and you don't know what that outcome is going to be, it's a really tough thing. So, certainly it's most extreme when it comes to people who are making the decision to be involved in human rights struggles. Even at a day-to-day, though, we're all involved in things that we think are worthy, things that we're putting out in the world, and trying to make decisions between what are the trade-offs in terms of time spent with the family, even at that level? Or how are we supporting the next generation versus things that right now are calling to us as well? So how have folks in your family kind of thought about those things? I know you're a super involved auntie.
Yes, that's for sure. Well, I mean, I don't think they've seen it much in terms of personal costs for me. They're interested in the work that I do, but they also know that I'm doing it at a very safe distance. Yeah. There are moments where you're really needed for family things. So my parents are older now. My father's ill. And they want more from you. And
I'm sorry. Yeah.
And thank you. And he has an excellent caretaker in my mother, and they want more of your time, and you feel like they deserve that time and you should give it to them. But there's other things that you're also anxious to communicate and get out. So yeah, I think every woman in the world would tell you that no matter whether they're involved in the human rights struggle or not, that's an incredibly difficult balancing act you're trying to pull off all the time. But did you feel in writing your book that there was also, when you were talking about the struggles and challenges of these mothers, is there also a cultural component of an older generation and a younger generation that seems to be becoming more and more westernized in the context of the families in your book, or did you not find that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting dynamic for sure, because things have changed so fast. So you have, in the course of, and in a lot of countries where development has happened really fast, you have a much bigger gap between generations, because you have one group of people that have been raised in a very different way than the way that their children are being raised. They haven't moved, they haven't gone to a different country. They're still in the Islamic Republic. They're still Muslim. Those things haven't changed. And yet the context in which they're raising their kids has changed quite a bit. So I do think that there are some of those things that have changed and are different. And I think even without all of that, there's the generational, I think about Aunt Mehri and her role as the matriarch in the family. And that's a role that you could recognize around the world, really, where you have kind of an older female who's taken the helm of the family, has very strong opinions about what everyone should be doing.
Exactly. Who do I know like that?
I think it's rare to have a family where you don't know, there isn't somebody who's kind of playing that role. So I don't know if part of it's just, as we all get older, we take that on. So I'll have to be careful to make sure I don't turn into that someday.
Right. Of course. But I think that's part of what adds so much richness to the book. And in a way, it's a new landscape. Yes, there's the archetype that's familiar, but seeing it fleshed out with these cultural details from Iran makes it very new and really, really fascinating. So there's a question I'm dying to ask you, and I want to make sure I ask this one so that we don't run out of time before the Q&A. And it was really fascinating to me in your book, because it's one of the things I struggled with so much in writing Among the Ruins was how to portray people in their full humanity. So I was fascinated by your character, and I'm going to give him the Urdu pronunciation, which would be Sadegh, but I think you would say Sadegh.
That's pretty close, Sadegh.
Yeah. And he's a very pious young man, and he has faith. He has decent, sincere belief in the regime. And in the Basij, which is the pro-regime militia. And his faith in these institutions seems to derive from his belief that if people are God-fearing and practicing Muslims, then they're obviously going to act justly, because that's what their religion teaches them. And so he participates in the activities of the militia, and effectively, he really is one of them. But then as he gets exposed to the brutality of how the regime is putting down these protesters in the Green Movement, he's beginning to doubt himself and doubt them and have these second thoughts. And so he comes across as this character who's, he's at least involved with people who are doing terrible things. And yet we understand him and his humanity. So for you as a writer, what was the challenge in doing that? Because I've written characters who are terrorists, and I've been called on the floor for investing them with even an iota of humanity. How did you approach that in your writing? And what did you struggle with?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I think for myself, first of all, we do a real disservice when we don't show the humanity of even the most horrible people, because it becomes very easy to think that evil and evil people are something so far away from me, so distant from me, that I could never make that choice. And so then we're not on guard, to be thinking about, wait a second, what are the choices that I'm making, and how does that contribute to other people, and how does that contribute to stronger protections for people? So I feel actually very strongly that it's important to go right up and not do a straw man characterization of, to really understand. So first of all, so that then we can recognize what are the places within ourselves where we are tempted to go that direction. And secondly, so that we can offer a defense that is the strongest defense against that type of thing, because we've listened to, we've enumerated the strongest way that that position can be presented. And we're showing how that still is a false narrative. So that to me actually felt like a very important piece of what I was doing. And the other thing that for me was very exciting about Sadegh, these sorts of transformations, what they're exciting and fascinating. What happens when you have somebody that grows up in a specific institution? I grew up with two different institutions. So in that way, it was kind of helpful because I could kind of see, I wasn't in necessarily just one, really. I had these two different things where I could compare and see, oh, this has really great things. This has really great things. I think when you grow up in one, and even having that, I could see that in myself too, where you grow up in a particular way. You've been in an institution where you see not only that it's done good things for yourself, but it's done good things for others. You start to develop there can be inertia around being willing to see potential negative impacts of these institutions that you've mostly had a positive experience with. And it's not unique to Iran, of course, right? So like there are situations where, and I think it becomes challenged when you're in like an institution is doing well for you, but it's not doing well for somebody else. And if you look at Sadegh, part of what challenged him is when all of a sudden he finds out that he's related to people that these institutions are crushing, and that helps him see things in a different way. And in the US or other places, I mean, imagine if your son comes out as gay or is going to marry a Black woman, all of a sudden, if you're a white person and you're used to a particular set of institutions that have worked really well for you, all of a sudden you're questioning those things, you're wondering. And I think those types of transformations, what causes us to question the institutions that we've generally seen as good, and to see kind of places where they're not working for everybody and to work to fix them, are really, really interesting. So that was just a really fun part of writing that character, is being able to be on that journey with them. So I would say those things, one, not wanting to have a straw man argument, wanting to give the best version of that argument and still show it as false, and then going on this personal transformation just because it was interesting to me, were parts of what made up Sadegh.
Have you received any criticism for that?
I haven't gotten too much pushback on that yet, so it'll be interesting to see if that comes. So I'm curious what kind of pushback you've gotten. You've probably made the same arguments, and what are people saying? I should get ready.
So I have to admit that I didn't have such complexity and nuance in any of my regime characters. Right, there were prison guards in Kadizak and Evin, and there were the people who were suffering the brutality of those guards. And so it was pretty black and white from the picture that I was painting. But I had this one character whose brother was imprisoned, and her name was Nasreen. And then she had to make a decision about whether she was going to keep on fighting for the Green Movement if it meant that something terrible could happen to her brother. And so, but I mean, for me, that was an easy character to portray because it's a sympathetic portrayal, and I think people could understand the difficulty of that choice. I think it'd be much more difficult to try to portray someone like Sadegh, as you've done so beautifully, so much so that when I was reading the book, that was the character, to my own surprise, that I had identified with the most and was most concerned about. How are things going to turn out for him? Where is he going to end up after all of this? And also the interesting thing to me is that I have friends like that who have who aren't part of the Basij, but who have believed so strongly in the Iranian regime and who've had blinders on for so long, in the sense that they have not been able to understand these massive human rights abuses committed in the regime's name. But meanwhile, this fig leaf of utmost piety and propriety is there to shield it all. So they haven't been able to see beyond the shield. And they're amazing people, who otherwise are completely in favor of human rights all around the globe. So to me, that's been having conversations with them without having them devolve into like you're a terrible person, and no, you're a terrible person has been an interesting challenge. But I think that's one of the most interesting things about writing about human rights struggles is that you get to make them so intimate and personal. And that's one of the things that your book has done so well, where on the one hand, you're in constant suspense that, oh my God, how are things going to turn out for this character? Are they going to get arrested? Are they going to be tortured? Will they be detained? And how is their family life going to implode or explode, depending on what choices that they've made along the way? It's a difficult thing to write, but it's so rewarding when an author pulls it off well, as you've done in this book so beautifully. And I see that we have about 15 minutes left, and it looks like we have quite a lot of author questions. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and time with us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Brittany so she can moderate the questions for you.
Well, I'm just going to quickly jump in and just say, I mean, it just means so much to hear your kind words about the book as someone that I've admired for a long time. And I'm thrilled that you think that I got that balance kind of okay with Sadegh, because it really was a challenging character to write. And on the other side, the thing that I was afraid of, because I have so much respect for people who have put their lives on the line, I didn't want it to be an apology. I didn't want to lionize somebody that perhaps was in a position to cause folks like that pain. So I'm glad that it feels like I kind of got the balance right on that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have so many audience questions? This is great. So I'll start with this one. This person says, what was the impetus for deciding to write this book? And what was the hardest part of writing and bringing the story to closure?
Yeah, so I always kind of knew that I wanted to write something about Iran as I spent more time there. And I've written and thought about this. It's almost like you want to, and I think anybody can relate to this who's had the opportunity to spend time in different cultures, or even just with different groups of people within the same culture. And when you feel like there's so much misunderstanding between those two groups, you really want to find a way to bring them together. And it's so hard with Iran, right? We have no diplomatic relations. There are very few opportunities for folks to get to know one another. So I wanted to create like this portal for people to get to know each other. So that was really, I knew that I wanted to do a book about Iran. And then the 2009 election itself, of course, was something so dramatic and so big. And there were so many people that I admired that were involved in it. And then there were people where I was really surprised at the reactions that they had. And it felt like, oh, this will be an interesting kind of vehicle for talking about what's going on in Iran right now. I also felt like there just were not enough books about present day Iran. Ausma, your book is really one of the few. So many of the books even that come out now are still about the 1979 revolution, which of course is a very big and important thing to take, to unpack. But I wanted to have something that was more current and recent. And then it was really fun thinking about the different characters. And so we're having a character like Sarah, where it's this person who's very innocent, and you want to have ideally a society where you can have young people that are innocent and just thinking about their weddings or just thinking about their decor. But at some point, when does that innocence actually tiptoe into complicity, where what you're doing is you're putting blinders on because you don't want anything to disrupt what feels like a comfortable existence to you? So each character just really gave me an opportunity to play with and think about different ideas and things that challenge me in my own life. When am I choosing innocence? When am I not pushing myself to make sure that I'm making the decisions to stand up for others when I can? So that was Sarah. Sadegh, we've kind of talked about the opportunity to talk about those types of personal transformations. And then Azar really represented people who are so driven in a way that I admire to make those choices, and are just so, that just can't bear the injustice and the choices that she has to make and think about in terms of her family, protecting her family versus going out in the streets. So what happened, I think, was just the 2009 event became, that's what I want to write about. And then for me, it was these characters who would be grappling with that, and who would have kind of these interesting experiences and transformations during those times. And once I got the characters, then it was just a question of filling in the story.
Okay, the next question, and I know both of you kind of talked about your family a bit, but this question is, how did the Mormon side of your family and the Islamic side of your family align or conflict with one another?
Well, over the many, many years. So one thing that's really fun about that I'm so grateful to my parents about, I think a lot of times when people of different faiths marry, it's because they've left their respective religions. So as a kid reading, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, where you've got a family they've both kind of left their respective faiths. So my parents got married, but they were both still super active and and really the story goes that they both felt that kind of some divine guidance that the other was going to convert at some point. This is part of underlying the marriage. And that never happened. But what did happen is that we got to go to church. We got to go to the masjid. We got to go to regular Doi Kumails. I got to go on the Hajj with my father. I was going to Bible study in the morning. So we were very, very involved with both of those communities. And in terms of kind of the families, I think as with everything, when you're exposed to something new, there are things about it that are a little bit strange. They're on and then after a while, you're just family. So I would say, yeah, initially, I think there were some interesting conversations as people were getting to know each other. And then after years and years of being together and being a part of each other's lives and being exposed to one another, then it's just, and I feel very lucky and blessed to have gotten to grow up with these two communities that as a young person, it felt like overload. I felt really weird compared to kind of many of my peers, but as an adult, it feels like something that really gave me access to two wonderful communities. Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. The next question I would love to hear both of your thoughts on. Someone asks, what lessons and parallels would you draw from Iran's stolen election relative to what's happening in today's election in the US and maybe other places?
Ausma, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, there's things that we fear, right? That we fear that there won't be a peaceful transfer of power because that rhetoric's been there in the background. And we've been seeing ever since the last election when Trump was elected, the slow creep towards, maybe not that slow creep towards authoritarianism, which is so familiar from Iranian politics and also from where my parents are from, Pakistan, which is nominally a democracy, but the military is in the background there. So this idea that we're even circulating the idea that there may not be a peaceful transfer of power, that militias could be called out to intimidate voters in voting lines, that voting lines are so long. These are all hallmarks of authoritarian societies and authoritarian regimes that do not believe in free and fair elections and that do not respect a peaceful transfer of power, that no matter what happens and what the people want for themselves, they intend to hold on to power by any means necessary. And we've seen that in countries around the world. And I think people here have a very strange impression of Iran, right? They see it as those black clad mobs raising their fists, death to America, burning the American flag and chanting in support of Ayatollah Khomeini, when Iran is such an incredibly sophisticated nation. Its politics are so sophisticated, its theologies are so sophisticated, and the level of democratic development and argumentation inside Iran has been so sophisticated. And then there's this great tragedy of authoritarianism on top of it. And it's the parallel I see is that great tragedy in the United States, which has been to all extents, has been a democracy that's functioned fairly well, where the people's voice can be heard. Although, of course, like with any democracy, there's all these problems of power being corrupted by its links with money. But those similarities to me are deeply troubling, and it would be a terrible thing to see a functioning, vital democracy be eroded more and more by the intrusion of money into politics and these Trump-led authoritarian-style tendencies. So I think that might have been a bit long-winded, but now I'm going to turn it over to you.
No, I think that was all so well said. I think my hope is that the similarities end on November 3rd.
Yes.
That we don't see.
God willing.
It is one of the things that's also just been hard to see in the US. You kind of alluded to it, Ausma, this sense of, well, if you have a person who's pious, then everything should be fine. And I think that that was really kind of the original mistake in Iran, where the focus was not on, okay, well, we need to create institutions that will function regardless of people's positions on a wide variety of things. It was, we just need to get rid of the Shah, and we need to have a pious person at the top, and maybe they'll have the same kind of power. We're not really touching the power structure or institutions all that much. We're just getting a new person, and since they're good, everything's going to be fine. And so there's this real attachment often in the language and in the conversation about who are the good people, who are the pious Muslims, and as long as we have them, it's okay. And anybody who opposes us, they're not pious. And that's been something that for me has been really alarming to see in the US over the past 4 years, is kind of this deepening sense of, who are, that we'll hear from the highest levels of power, that a particular party or a particular group of people, that they're, or the enemy of the people, that this designation of different groups of people as evil in a way that I hadn't really seen in the US up until that time. So yeah, again, my hope is that whatever parallels we've seen will end on November 3rd, and whatever happens, we will have a peaceful transition.
Yeah, and to get back to your point, Ehsaneh, one of those groups that's being called out as an enemy of the people, of course, is the free press. Yeah. And no democracy can function effectively without a neutral third-party free press. So that's troubling to see. We see that in all these authoritarian regimes across the globe. One of the first things they do is crush the free press. We've seen it in a country that was on the verge of a proper functioning democracy like Turkey. One of the first things they did was purge the free press when it's taken this authoritarian turn. So that's troubling. And the other interesting parallel that I just thought of, which came out of your answer, was in Iran, that separation between mosque and state didn't happen when it needed to. And now we're seeing in American politics this infusion of evangelical Christianity interfering in every aspect of American government now, to the sense, and we're looking at this potential Supreme Court justice who hasn't been able to separate religion and politics, and that's going to have an impact on the rights of women, women's reproductive rights for, maybe decades to come. So that's another scary similarity that I never thought that I would see between these two nations.
Yeah, and that actually answers a question that was basically about, people think that we're so safe in the US from anything like that happening, from anything like a dictatorship or any kind of totalitarian regime. But that sometimes it feels closer than I think we are comfortable admitting. So that leads into, that's a great transition to this question from Kristen. And she says, what would be your biggest wish for a US policy change on Iran?
Go ahead.
I mean, lift the sanctions.
Lift the sanctions.
Lift the sanctions. I think this actually, it's very similar to the question around when you're thinking about human rights activism, in the sense of like, what do you do when you have a government that is doing destructive things, both for their own people and perhaps internationally? And I think what has been tried, or what is the rhetoric, is that we're going to make life so miserable that this regime is going to change, that the people will rise up and they will. And frankly, if I knew that it's going to be 6 months of hell, and then the regime is going to change, and then it's going to be butterflies and unicorns, and it's going to be democracy, and it's going to be wonderful, that's something that I would think about seriously. But our track record is not good. Our track record on regime change, what's going to come afterwards, is even when Iran did regime change on their own, with the people rising up for it, that track record did not turn out so well. The track record of sanctions is awful when you look at the impact on people right now not being able to get access to the medicines that they need to address things like Parkinson's or epilepsy or other, like, these are things that people right now are impacted by. And the additional sanctions that came on, and that are sanctioning things like an agricultural bank that gives loans to farmers. So the type of squeezing that's happening, and the type of pain that's being caused to people, to my mind, doesn't have a good track record even of causing regime change. And even if regime change were to happen, it's not clear that that's necessarily going to go in a more positive direction. And I would say, just generally speaking, slower forms of change and evolution are generally better for people who are living in those situations so that they can kind of evolve and move with things. It's not as hard on populations. And I'd really love to see in the US a more sophisticated policy that recognizes that you've got these different centers of power, and you can build incentives for different types of behavior. And I think back to even, and this maybe isn't the best example, but there are all these missed opportunities in the mid-90s when Iran's the first opening to a Western oil company, it chose to do a contract with an American oil company, which was seen by many as kind of a signal. So what would have happened if relations were built then, as opposed to kind of sanctions being slapped on in response to this oil deal, but relations were built then, and you have incentives that grow, and there are more and more people that see an incentive that it's better for them to kind of have better relationships with the world so that their incentives are aligned with kind of moving in that direction. To me, it feels it's so tragic and such a missed opportunity that what's happened over and over again is that all of Iran has been labeled as axis of evil, and the policy implements that we've put in terms of sanctions and other things have been things that have really hurt the people. So I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what you think about this, Ausma.
I agree with you that sanctions always affect the most vulnerable members of the society, and they affect very little change on top. And in the case of Iran, sanctions have basically allowed the black market to flourish, which again benefits those people at the top who control those markets. So it's having the exact opposite effect of what they're intended to have. And we also saw the disastrous effect of sanctions on the Iraqi people in that era. So we already know what a failed program it typically is. And then secondly, this idea that if you inflict enough pain on a civilian population, that they're somehow going to rise up and be able to bring down their dictators or their authoritarian leaders doesn't work in situations where the state has the monopoly on the use of force. And we've seen that most dramatically just recently in Syria, where the people did rise up, arguing for political freedom, democracy, human dignity. And the state not only had a monopoly on the use of force, but used it ruthlessly against its own people, demolishing Aleppo, demolishing parts of Damascus, sending, I don't know what the numbers are now, some 11 million people into poverty or into refugee status, and running these execution and torture factories inside the prison system. So it's assuming a level of ability and access to power and force on the behalf of a civilian population that simply doesn't exist. So it's a very unfair calculation to make. It doesn't produce results. And the other thing I think we need to see is what I'm hoping to see is a resumption of the Iran nuclear agreement. I think that's another important foreign policy step that will go some distance towards normalizing relations and help get Iran back into a community of nations, which could then have perhaps more soft power openings for other countries to intervene diplomatically with Iran. I never think it's fair to punish the people of a nation.
Yeah.
My last question for tonight will be, I know we were talking a little bit in the green room, Ausma, about your upcoming book, but is there a book that you guys are either reading right now or excited to read in the future that you can tell our audience about?
Oh, well, I'm dying to know about the secret second project of Ehsaneh's, but I don't know if I'm putting her on the spot. I recently read a beautiful book by Sadr Mustafa, who is a Palestinian-American writer, called The Beauty of Your Face. So I strongly encourage people to pick it up. One, because there's very few Palestinian stories in mainstream fiction. Two, because she's an amazing writer. And three, because it's really a novel about the political moment of our times. Like Ehsaneh's book, it's an intimate, personal family story about a Palestinian woman who comes from a difficult family situation where she has a mentally ill mother, her sister has disappeared, and she's been constantly bullied, both for being Arab and for being Muslim. And then she finds this sisterhood and this community of women who help her to find her place, her voice, and she becomes the principal of an Islamic school. And just as her life is getting back on track, there's a school shooting in that Islamic school, which is targeted because the students are Muslims. And so it's a book about our polarized politics, about the rise of Islamophobia around the globe, and what it means to belong to minority identity in a country, in a community that's very hostile to that identity. So it's called The Beauty of Your Face. It's an absolutely gorgeous book by Sadr Mustafa.
And I'll share about a book by Homa, Daughters of Smoke and Fire. And what I loved about this, Homa, this is one of the first books, maybe the first, by a Kurdish Iranian writer in English, and really gives voice. So the Kurds are a group of people who have been seriously oppressed in Iran. Their experience is tragic. It is not well known enough at all. And so it's an opportunity to kind of see, to learn more about that group of people in Iran. And she does such, I mean, it's lyrical and beautiful and haunting. And you really see the price of oppression in the way that the choices that her family makes. And then this young character, as she's struggling and ultimately ends up leaving Iran, the choices that she's making and how that impacts her life as well. Just a beautiful, beautiful book. I couldn't recommend it enough.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. This was such an amazing conversation. Everyone watching, please go out and buy the book. I put actually 2 links in the chat, one for Ehsaneh's book and one so that you can explore kind of all of Ausma's titles that we have at PNP. Both independent bookstores and authors need your support more than ever right now. This pandemic has just knocked everyone's plans clearly out of whack. And so we just thank you so much for showing up today and for supporting us and our authors. And of course, ladies, thank you so much for being here. This was such a great, a nice Sunday treat.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Ehsaneh. It was a beautiful experience and a conversation. I'm really proud to have been a part of it.
This was so wonderful. Honestly, I can't think of anybody else I would have wanted to have this conversation with more, and just really, really enjoyed talking to you, Ausma, and this was a wonderful, thank you for setting this up, Brittany.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. So everyone, please enjoy the rest of your Sunday, stay safe, and stay well read.